Year 7, Mr. Tapley here for your next lesson of Year 7 Humanities in Term 3. So this lesson, we're going to be developing our skills and our knowledge. So our knowledge is going to be our understanding of ancient Australia, and the skill that we will be focusing on, not just in this lesson, but for the CAT for Year 7 History, is source analysis. So if that's why it seems like we're doing a bit of that in each lesson, that's the reason. We want to prepare you for the CAT at the end of the term. So we're practicing our ability to analyze primary and secondary sources. Success criteria is to expand our knowledge of ancient Australian life, culture, and history by interpreting and evaluating historical sources. So, in our previous lesson, just giving you a recap, we developed our understanding of the tools historians use to develop their understanding of the past, which are, of course, primary and secondary sources. A primary source is a document or an object created during the historical time being studied. These artifacts offer a first-hand experience of history. It was there when the history was happening. Sorry. A secondary source interprets and analyzes primary sources. So the object or the text or the image of that secondary source was created after the historical time being studied. So primary was created during, secondary created after the fact. A secondary source may include pictures or text of primary sources from the past, just to be confusing. So your textbook is a secondary source. However, it might have pictures of primary sources in it. It's still a secondary source. It's just using those primary sources to then evaluate history, if that makes sense. So a secondary source isn't from history. It's interpreting and analyzing the primary sources from the past in the present. So the secondary source was not present when this historical event was being created. So if you're confused, you're looking at your textbook like, is this a primary or secondary source? Think about when that textbook was made, think about what you are studying, and then do the math there. If it was around in 221 BC, when the Great Wall of China was finished, then it's a primary source. If not, otherwise it is a secondary source. So, after that little refresher, you guys should have no problem with our lesson activities for today. So to expand upon our overview of ancient Australia, introduced in the previous lesson, we will be examining primary and secondary sources related to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander life, history, and culture. I went backwards, but anyway. Lesson activities. So the next 5 slides, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There we go. The next 5 slides have a selection of primary and secondary sources. In your digital notebook, complete the following questions for each source. So this lesson, your activities are going to say source 1, and then you're going to answer question 1, 2, source 2, question 1, 2, source 3, question 1, 2, etc. So the 2 main questions that you'll be answering, and you guys should have a bit of practice from the last learning test we did on primary sources and secondary sources. Question 1, is this source a primary or a secondary source? Explain your response. So you can't just say primary and then move on. You need to tell me why it is a primary source. How can you prove to me that it is a primary source? Question 2. Identify what this source tells us about ancient Australian life. And I understand we haven't done a lot on ancient Australia yet. We're still in the very first week. But I've given you some little topics there that you could consider when looking at the primary source. So does this source or the secondary source tell me about family life in ancient Australia? Does it tell me about their religion, their spiritual beliefs? Does it tell me about hunting, warfare, farming, travel, how they moved from point A to point B, art, etc., etc.? So, source 1 is a timeline of ancient Australia. It was created in your 2020 Year 7 History Jacaranda textbook. The source features images of primary sources from ancient Australian history and the dates of key events from 120,000 BCE to 1788 when the European settlers arrived in Australia. So is that a primary source or a secondary source? Question 1. And then what can it tell us about ancient Australian life? If you can't read it, you might need to zoom in. Otherwise, you can open up your textbook. It's at the very start of chapter 3. Question 2. This book was written by Billy Griffiths in 2018 about his experiences as a historian, as an archaeologist. So it's called Deep Time Dreaming, Uncovering Ancient Australia. So the source details the uncovering of Aboriginal history over the past 50 years and the meaning of Aboriginal identity. So it covers his expeditions into different parts of Australia and the artifacts and the sources that he's found in the ground or on cave walls or in rock art, painting, etc. The book features quotes from Aboriginal elders discussing their own spiritual beliefs and culture. Primary source or secondary source? Question 1. Question 2. What can it tell us about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander life? Source 3. This emu feather skirt of the Jawarung people, who are a Aboriginal tribe in Melbourne, was worn during ritual dances. So the skirt was passed down from family members through generations of history as part of their heritage and culture. So a ritual dance probably implies that it was something done relating to religion, relating to their spiritual beliefs. Source 4. This rock art painting in Western Australia is a representation of the Wandjina. I'm going to mispronounce every word, I apologise. The Wandjina are the spiritual ancestors of the Aboriginal people near the Kimberley region, which is in Western Australia. The Aboriginals believe these spirits controlled the rain, and that recognizing the spirits in artwork or through ritual dances would improve the land. They get more rain, more food, happy. Archaeologists have dated the paintings to be at least 4,000 years old. Source 5. This painting by Joseph Lycett in 1820 attempted to reconstruct Aboriginal life before European settlers arrived in 1788. The painting shows how Aboriginals used fire as a tool to hunt for animals and create grasslands for tribal camps. So what they would do is they would have these controlled burns of fire that would get rid of all the trees, obviously, and then they're like, oh cool, look at all this free real estate where I can put up my little tent and have parties with my mates. Or they would use the fire as kind of like a tool to trap animals or to push animals towards the hunters. So the animals would see the fire and they go heck, and then they'd run away right into the hunters, and that's how they get food. Very clever use of fire. So you've got 5 sources there, primary or secondary sources, I won't tell you, you tell me. Write it in your digital notebook, and then tell me 1 or 2 sentences. It doesn't have to be an essay length response, because we haven't really done a lot on those topics, but we will. So a couple sentences about what you can learn about this object, from this object, about ancient Australian life. Cool? Alright. If you've got any questions, please let me know. Email me, Google Classroom, etc. Best of luck, and cheers.